The Vraxoth were the most feared creatures in the known galaxy, and every spacefaring species had learned this truth through blood and death and the screams of entire worlds. They stood 12 feet tall when fully grown, and their bodies were covered in natural armor that could stop plasma fire, and their claws could tear through starship hulls like paper, and their 6 burning amber eyes held an intelligence that made them even more terrifying than simple beasts. They were not animals, and they were not mindless monsters, and that was what made them so dangerous. The Vraxoth were smart, and they were patient, and they remembered every wrong done to them across generations, and they passed down hatred like other species passed down stories. Every species in the galaxy had one rule when it came to the Vraxoth, and that rule was simple and absolute. You do not negotiate with them, and you do not reason with them, and you do not try to make peace with them. You run or you die. The colony ship Meridians Hope had been carrying 243 souls when the engine failure happened, and the ship had torn itself apart in the upper atmosphere of a planet called Calath 7, and by the time the wreckage stopped burning, only 200 people were still breathing. Sergeant Alara Vance pulled herself from the ruins with blood running down her face and fire in her lungs, and she started counting survivors before she even knew where she was. She was 34 years old, and she had served in the Terran Defense Force for 12 years, and she had seen combat on 6 different worlds, and none of that had prepared her for what she saw when she looked up at the sky. 2 moons hung overhead, and the stars were wrong, and the jungle around them was too green and too alive and too hungry. And then the ship's navigator checked their position, and his face went white, and his hands started shaking, and he said the words that made everyone's blood turn to ice. They had crashed on a Vraxoth nesting world. Alara remembered the briefings, and she remembered the warnings, and she remembered the footage of what the Vraxoth did to colonies that wandered too close to their territory. She had seen the aftermath of Meridian Station, and she had seen what was left of the mining outpost on Krull 4, and she had seen the faces of the rescue teams, who found nothing but bones and silence. For a moment she wanted to sit down and give up and wait for death, but she was a soldier, and she had people depending on her, and so she pushed the fear down into a dark corner of her mind, and she started giving orders. They fortified the wreckage, and they set up a perimeter, and they rationed the emergency supplies, and they activated the distress beacon, and they prayed to whatever gods would listen. Dr. Jonah Reyes was the only medical officer who survived the crash, and he worked for 3 days straight without sleep, pulling survivors from the wreckage and treating wounds and setting bones and doing everything he could to keep people alive. He was 41 years old, and he had gray streaks in his dark hair, and his hands were steady even when everything around him was falling apart. He had been a combat medic before he joined the colonial service, and he had saved lives on battlefields where the sky was on fire and the ground was soaked with blood. But this was different. This was not a battle they could fight, and this was not an enemy they could defeat. And every day that passed without rescue was another day closer to discovery. The jungle watched them, and the jungle waited, and sometimes at night they heard sounds in the darkness that made groan soldiers weep. 3 weeks passed. The distress beacon kept sending its signal into the void, and no answer came, and hope began to die like a candle running out of wax. Alara kept the patrols running, and she kept the weapons ready, and she kept telling everyone that rescue was coming, even though she had stopped believing in herself. And then on the 22nd day, everything changed. It was early morning, and the fog was thick, and the air was heavy with moisture, and Private Chun was on watch duty at the eastern barricade when he saw something moving in the tree. Linny raised his rifle, and he activated the alarm, and within seconds, every armed colonist was at the wall with weapons pointed at the jungle. But what emerged from the trees was not a hunting party, and it was not a war band, and it was not the death they had been expecting. It was a single Vraxoth female matriarch. She was massive even by the standards of her species, and she stood nearly 14 feet tall, and her armor plating was scarred with the marks of 100 battles, and her eyes burned with an intelligence that made Alara's skin crawl. But she was not attacking, she was not even threatening. She was walking slowly and carefully, and in her massive clawed arms, she was carrying something small, something that was bleeding, something that was making sounds no human had ever heard of Raxith make. It was a cub, her cub, and it was dying. The matriarch stopped at the edge of the clearing, and she looked at the humans, with their weapons and their fear and their desperation, and she did something that went against every known behavior of her species. She laid her cub on the ground between them, and then she stepped back, and then she waited. The colonists did not know what to do, and they did not know what this meant, and they did not know if this was a trap or a trick or something else entirely. But Jonah knew. He looked at the matriarch, and he saw past the armor and the claws and the burning eyes, and he saw something he recognized. He saw a mother. He saw a mother who had carried her dying child through the jungle to find help, and he saw a mother who was desperate enough to trust her enemies, and he saw a mother who would do anything to save her baby. And Jonah was a healer, and healers do not turn away the dying. He put down his medical kit, and he stepped forward, and Alara grabbed his arm, and her voice was sharp with fear. She asked him what he was doing, and she told him this was madness, and she told him the Vraxoth would kill them all. Jonah looked at her, and his eyes were calm, and his voice was steady. He told her he was going to do his job, and then he walked toward the dying cub, while the war beast watched in silence. Jonah walked across the clearing, and every step felt like a mile, and every breath felt like it might be his last. The matriarch watched him, and her 6 amber eyes tracked his movements with a precision that made his heart pound against his ribs. She could kill him before he even saw her move, and she could tear him apart with a single swipe of those massive claws, and she could end everything in less than a second. She did not move. She stood like a statue made of armor and muscle and barely contained violence, and she watched, and she waited behind him. Jonah could hear Alara shouting orders, and he could hear rifles being raised, and he could hear the fear in the voices of the colonists. They thought he was walking to his death, and maybe they were right. But Jonah had spent his whole life walking toward death and pulling people back from the edge, and he was not going to stop. Now, just because the patient had claws and the mother could destroy worlds, he reached the cub, and he knelt down in the dirt, and he got his first real look at what he was dealing with. The cub was small by Vraxoth standards, but it was still the size of a large dog, and its armor plating was thinner than adults and more flexible, and in several places that armor was cracked and broken. Something had attacked this cub, and something had torn into its side and left wounds that were deep and ragged and filled with infection. Black ichor leaked from the gashes, and the smell was sharp and chemical and wrong, and the cub's breathing was shallow and fast, and its eyes were glazed with pain. Jonah had seen wounds like this before on human soldiers, and he knew what they meant. Without treatment, the cub would be dead within hours. The infection was spreading, and the body was failing, and death was coming fast. Jonah opened his medical kit, and he looked at the tools inside, and he felt a cold wave of doubt wash over him. Had bandages and antiseptic and surgical instruments and painkillers and antibiotics, and everything a field medic needed to save human lives. But this was not a human. This was a Vraxoth, and Vraxoth biology was classified as incompatible with treatment by every medical database in the Terran Union. Their blood was acidic, and it could eat through standard surgical gloves in minutes, and their immune system was aggressive enough to kill a doctor mid-operation, and their anatomy was unmapped and unknown. There were no guides for this, and there were no protocols, and there was no precedent. Every doctor who had ever tried to study Vraxoth biology had done so on corpses, and even that was dangerous. No one had ever tried to save a living Vraxoth. No one had ever been given the chance. Jonah looked at the dying cub, and he looked at the matriarch watching him with those burning eyes, and he made a decision. he was going to try anyway. He pulled on 3 pairs of surgical gloves, layered on top of each other, and he hoped that would buy him enough time before the blood ate through. He reached for the wound, and the cub snapped at him with teeth that could crush bone, and he pulled his hand back. Just in time, the matriarch made a sound. It was low and deep, and it rumbled through the ground like distant thunder, and for a moment, Jonah was certain she was about to kill him, but then the cub went still, and its eyes moved to its mother, and something passed between them that Jonah did not understand. The matriarch had told her cub to let him work. Jonah let out a breath he did not know. He was holding, and he reached for the wound again. The cub did not bite it, whimpered, and it trembled, and its whole body was tense with pain and fear, but it did not fight him. Jonah began to work. He talked as he cleaned the wound, and he did not know if the Vraxith could understand him, but he had read somewhere that they were sensitive to vocal patterns and tones. He told the cub that everything was going to be okay, and he told it that he knew it hurt, and he told it that he needed it to be brave. He told it that its mother had brought it a long way, and he told it not to make her regret that choice. The hours passed, and the sun moved across the sky, and Jonah lost himself in the work. He irrigated the wound with neutralizing compounds, and he guessed at pH levels based on how the tissue reacted, and he got it wrong twice before he found something that did not make things worse. He debrided the dead tissue and cut away the parts that were too infected to save, and his gloves dissolved 3 times, and each time he had to pull back and put on new ones and pray that none of the acidic blood had touched his skin. He found the source of the infection, and it was a fragment of something lodged deep in the wound, and it looked like a claw tip from another Vraxith, and that told him this cub had been attacked by one of its own kinda. Territorial dispute maybe, or a challenge from a rival bloodline, or something else entirely that humans did not understand. He pulled the fragment out, and the cub screamed, and the matriarch surged forward, and for one terrible moment, Jonah was certain he was about to die, but the matriarch stopped, and she looked at her cub, and she looked at the fragment in Jonah's bloody forceps, and she understood what he had done. She settled back, and her eyes never left him, but the violence in her posture faded. Just a little. Jonah kept working. He synthesized a polymer sealant from compounds in his kit, and he mixed things together that had never been tested on alien physiology, and he prayed that he was not about to poison his patient. He sealed the wound, and he wrapped it in bandages, and he pumped the cub full of broad-spectrum antibiotics that might do nothing, or might help, or might kill it faster. Twice the cub's heart stopped. The first time, Jonah did not even know what was happening because he did not know Vraxith had more than one heart, but he figured it out when he felt the chest and found 3 separate rhythms, and one of them was missing. Did chest compressions, and he adjusted for the different anatomy, and he pushed down on the spot where the 3rd heart should be. And after 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, the rhythm came back. The second time was worse because the cub had grown weaker and the response was slower, and Jonah had to work for almost 2 minutes before he felt the heartbeat return. Both times, the matriarch watched in silence. Both times, she did not interfere. Both times, Jonah saw something in her eyes that he had never expected to see in a Vraxithopath. Night came, and the work continued, and Jonah's hands cramped, and his back ached, and his eyes burned from exhaustion. The colonists brought him water, and they brought him fresh gloves, and they stood at a distance and watched and waited. Alara kept her rifle trained on the matriarch the entire time, and the matriarch never looked at her and never acknowledged her presence. She only watched Jonah, and she only watched her cub when dawn broke over Cala 7, and the first light of the sun painted the sky in colors of orange and gold. The cub's breathing had steadied, and its fever had broken, and its eyes had cleared. It was not healed, and it was not safe, and it would need weeks of care to fully recover. But it was alive. Jonah sat back on his heels, and he looked at his work, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like a doctor again. The matriarch rose to her full height, and she walked toward him, and every colonist raised their weapon, and every finger tightened on every trigger. But Jonah did not move. The matriarch stopped in front of him, and she lowered her massive head until her eyes were level with his, and then she did something that no Vraxoth had ever done to a human. She closed her eyes. In the language of her people, this was the ultimate sign of trust, and it meant that she was placing her life in his hands, and it meant that she believed he would not harm her. Jonah did not know this, but he felt it somehow. He understood. And in that moment, something changed between two species that had only ever known war. The days after the surgery were strange and tense, and filled with a kind of wonder that none of the colonists had ever expected to feel. The matriarch did not leave. She settled at the edge of the camp like a living mountain, and she made a nest from fallen trees and torn vegetation, and she watched over her cub, and she watched over the humans who had saved it. At first the colonists were terrified, and they kept their weapons ready at all times, and they slept in shifts, and they waited for the attack that they were certain would come. But the attack never came. Instead, something else happened. Other predators stopped coming near the camp. Jungle of Khalid 7 was filled with dangerous creatures, and the colonists had spent 3 weeks fighting off things with too many teeth, and too many legs, and too much hunger. But now those creatures kept their distance, and the nights were quiet, and the patrols stopped finding tracks near the perimeter. Matriarch's presence was a warning that nothing on this world dared to challenge. And it was not just the animals that stayed away. On the third day after the surgery, the colonists saw shapes moving in the distant tree line, and those shapes were Vraxoth, and there were many of them. Alara counted at least 12 adults, and she felt her blood turn to ice, and she ordered everyone to the barricades. But the Vraxoth did not approach. They watched from a distance, and they communicated with the matriarch in sounds that humans could not hear, and then they melted back into the jungle and disappeared. Later, Jonah would learn that those Vraxoth had come to challenge the matriarch for bringing her cub to humans, and they had come to punish her for the betrayal of their kind. But when they saw her sitting beside the human camp, and when they saw her cub alive and healing, and when they saw the human doctor who had done the impossible, they did not attack. They did not understand what had happened, and they did not know how to respond. And so they retreated to watch and to wait and to see what would come next. The matriarch had gambled everything on a desperate hope, and that hope had paid off, and now the other Vraxoth were uncertain, and that uncertainty kept the colonists alive. Jonah visited the cub every morning and every evening, and he changed the bandages, and he checked the wound, and he monitored the healing. What he saw amazed him. Vraxoth biology was regenerating at a rate that made human medicine look primitive, and the wound that should have taken months to heal was closing in days, and new armor plating was already forming over the damaged areas. The cub was going to make a full recovery. Jonah documented everything he could, and he took notes, and he made observations. And he knew that what he was learning could change the relationship between humans and Vraxoth forever. But he was careful not to treat the cub like a specimen. Treated it like a patient. He talked to it while he worked, and he told it stories about Earth, and about the places he had been and the people he had known. He did not know if the cub understood his words, but it seemed to respond to his voice, and it would grow calm when he spoke, and its eyes would follow him with something that looked almost like curiosity. On the 5th day, the cub tried to stand. Its legs were weak and shaky, and it fell twice before it managed to stay upright, and Jonah watched with his heart in his throat, because he knew how dangerous this moment was. If the cub fell wrong, it could tear open the wound and undo everything he had worked for. But the cub was careful, and it was patient, and it stood there on trembling legs, and it looked at Jonah with those 6 amber eyes, and then it took a step toward him. The matriarch made a sound that was soft and low and almost gentle, and the cub stopped and looked at its mother. But then it took another step and another until it was standing right in front of Jonah, and its head came up to his chest, and its breath was warm against his hands. The cub pressed its nose against his palm, and in that moment, Jonah felt something break open inside him. Had spent his whole life saving people, and he had always kept a distance between himself and his patients, because that distance was what allowed him to function, and what kept him from drowning in the sorrow of the ones he could not save. But this was different. This cub had trusted him with its life, and its mother had trusted him with her child, and they had given him something precious and fragile, and he found that he did not want to let it go. He scratched the cub behind what he thought might be its ear, and the cub made a sound that was almost like a purr. Behind him, he heard one of the colonists laugh in disbelief, and he heard Alara swear under her breath, and he heard someone say that they never thought they would see the day. The matriarch watched, and her eyes were unreadable, but her posture was relaxed, and she did not seem concerned. She had made a choice when she brought her cub to the humans, and every day that passed seemed to confirm that she had chosen correctly. On the 8th day, the cub followed Jonah back to the main camp. This caused a panic, and colonists scattered and weapons were raised and someone screamed. But Jonah just held up his hands and told everyone to calm down, and the cub sat beside him like a loyal hound and waited for the chaos to settle. Alara approached with her rifle still in her hands, and her face was a mixture of fear and anger, and something else that might have been wonder. She asked Jonah if he had lost his mind, and she asked him what he thought he was doing, and she asked him how they were supposed to explain this to the rescue fleet if it ever arrived. Jonah just smiled, and he reached down and scratched the cub behind its ear. He told Alara that he was making a friend. The matriarch appeared at the edge of the camp, and she looked at her cub sitting beside the human doctor, and she made a sound that rumbled through the ground. The cub looked at its mother, and then it looked at Jonah, and then it lay down at his feet and closed its eyes. Was not going anywhere. The colonists did not know how to react, and they did not know what this meant, and they did not know if they should be terrified or grateful. But as the days passed and the cub stayed close to Jonah and the matriarch stayed close to the camp, they began to understand something that changed everything. They were not prisoners. They were not prey. They were something else entirely. They were under the protection of a Vraxith matriarch, and that protection extended to everyone in the camp, and it was the most powerful shield they could have asked for. For the first time since the crash, they stopped being afraid. For the first time, they started to believe they might actually survive. And it was all because one human doctor had looked at a dying alien and seen not a monster, but a patient. It was all because Jonah had done what humans did best. He had refused to give up. He had refused to accept the impossible. And he had reached across a gulf of fear and hatred and blood, and he had built a bridge with nothing but compassion and stubborn hope. The galaxy would never be the same. On the 15th day since Jonah had saved the cub, something happened that would change the course of human history. The morning started like any other, and the colonists went about their routines, and the cub followed Jonah as he made his rounds, checking on patients and distributing medicine. The cub had grown stronger every day, and its armor plating had fully regenerated, and the wound was now nothing but a faint scar beneath the new growth. It moved with the deadly grace that all Vraxoth possessed, but there was something different about the way it moved around the road, around the humans. It was careful, and it was gentle, and it stepped around the smaller colonists as if it understood how fragile they were. The children in the camp had started to lose their fear, and sometimes Jonah would catch them watching the cub with wonder in their eyes, and sometimes the braver ones would wave at it from a distance. The cub seemed to enjoy the attention, and it would sit very still when the children watched, and it would tilt its head in a way that almost looked playful. Jonah knew he should probably discourage this behavior because the cub was still a Vraxith, and it was still dangerous, and it could still kill a child without even trying. But he also saw how the cub responded to gentleness, and he saw how it had learned to control its strength around the humans, and he began to wonder if everything the galaxy believed about the Vraxith was wrong. Maybe they were not mindless killing machines, maybe. They had simply never been given a reason to be anything else. The afternoon sun was high and hot when the matriarch rose from her nest and began walking toward the camp. This was not unusual, and she often came closer to check on her cub, but something about her movement today was different. There was a purpose in her stride and a weight in her presence that made everyone stop what they were doing, and Washalara reached for her weapon, but she did not draw it, and she had learned over the past 2 weeks that the matriarch responded to respect and restraint. The matriarch walked past the outer barricades and past the watching colonists and past the cub that rose to greet her. She walked directly to Jonah, and then she stopped and she lowered her massive head until her eyes were level with his. The colonists held their breath, and the world seemed to go very still, and even the jungle sounds faded into silence. The matriarch opened her mouth and she spoke. It was not like any sound Jonah had ever heard, and it was not like anything the translation devices could process, and it took the computers almost 30 seconds to offer even a partial interpretation. But Jonah did not need the translation. He felt the meaning in his bones, and he heard it in the resonance of the sound, and he understood it in a place deeper than language. The matriarch had spoken her cub's name. Mung. The Vraxuth names were sacred, and they were secret, and they were never shared with outsiders of Vraxuth's true name was known only to its bloodline, and to speak it to another was an act of absolute trust. The matriarch had just given Jonah something that no human had ever received. She had given him her cub's name. The translation device finally caught up, and it rendered the name as a series of sounds that human mouths could not properly form. But Jonah tried anyway, spoke the name back to the matriarch, and he knew he was butchering the pronunciation, but he tried his best, and he put everything he had into getting it right. The matriarch listened, and her eyes burned with an intensity that would have terrified him 2 weeks ago, but now he saw something else in those eyes. He saw approval, he saw respect, he saw the beginning of something that had never existed between their species. The matriarch spoke again, and this time the sound was different, and this time the translation device worked faster. She was giving Jonah a name, his name a Vraxuth name. The device translated it as something like healer, and something like one who fights death, and something like chosen of blood. But those were just approximations, and Jonah knew that the true meaning was deeper and more complex and more significant than any human language could capture among. The Vraxuth only pack was named the only family, only those who belonged to the bloodline and were protected by its strength and were bound by its honor. The matriarch had just declared Jonah to be part of her family. She had claimed him as her own. The colonists did not fully understand what had happened, but they could feel the weight of the moment, and they could see the way the matriarch looked at Jonah, and they knew that something important had changed. Alara lowered her weapon completely for the first time in weeks, and she watched with wide eyes as the most dangerous creature on the planet performed what could only be described as a ceremony of adoption. The cub pressed against Jonah's side, and it made a sound that was warm and welcoming, and it looked up at him with those 6 amber eyes that no longer seemed alien. They seemed like family. Jonah reached down, and he placed his hand on the cub's head, and he spoke the name the matriarch had given him, and he accepted what was being offered. He did not know what this would mean for the future, and he did not know how the galaxy would react, and he did not know if this was the beginning of peace or just a strange moment that would be forgotten. But he knew that right now, in this moment, he was being given a gift, and he was not going to refuse it. The matriarch straightened to her full height, and she looked at the gathered colonists, and she made a sound that rolled through the camp like thunder. The translation device offered a single word: protected. Every human in this camp was now under the protection of her bloodline, and any attack on them was an attack on her family, and any threat to them would be met with the full fury of a Vraxith Matriarch, the colonists looked at each other, and they did not know whether to laugh or cry or fall to their knees in relief. They had come to this world expecting death, and they had found something else entirely. They had found an ally, they had found a protector, they had found a connection that transcended everything the galaxy thought it knew about humans and Vraxithand. It had all started because one doctor refused to see a monster when he looked at a dying child. Jonah stood in the center of the camp with a Vraxith cub at his side, and a Vraxith matriarch watching over him, and he felt something that he had not felt since the crash. He felt hope, real hope, not the desperate clinging hope of people waiting to die, but the strong burning hope of people who knew they were going to survive. The distress beacon was still transmitting, and somewhere out in the void rescue ships were searching, and sooner or later they would find this world, and when they did, they would find something they never expected. They would find humans and Vraxith standing together. They would find the impossible made real. They would find the first step toward a future that no one had ever imagined. Cub nudged Jonah's hand, and he looked down at those amber eyes, and he smiled. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The rescue fleet dropped out of hyperspace on the 31st day, and the colonists watched the sky light up with the drive signatures of 3 Terran battlecruisers. Adsel Helena Chun stood on the bridge of the flagship Indomitable, and she studied the sensor readings with growing concern. The distress beacon had led them to a Vraxith nesting world, and initial scans showed multiple Vraxith biosigns near the crash site, and every tactical protocol said this was a recovery mission, not a rescue. You did not find survivors on Vraxith worlds. You found remains, Admiral. Chun ordered a combat drop, and she sent 200 Marines in heavy assault armor with orders to secure any survivors and eliminate any threats. The dropship screamed through the atmosphere, and the Marines locked and loaded, and they prepared themselves for a fight that would be brutal and bloody and probably hopeless. What they found when they landed made them question everything they thought they knew. The first Marine out of the lead dropship was Lieutenant Marcus Webb, and he had fought Vraxith twice before, and both times he had been the only survivor of his unit. He expected to find a massacre. Instead, he found Sergeant Alara Vance standing calmly at the edge of a fortified camp, and beside her was the largest Vraxith he had ever seen. And the Vraxith was not attacking, it was waiting. Lieutenant Webb raised his weapon, and his finger found the trigger, and every instinct screamed at him to fire. But Alara held up her hand, and she told him to stand down, and she told him that there was something he needed to see. She led him into the camp, and what he saw there broke his brain in ways that would take months to repair. A human doctor was playing with a juvenile Vraxith. Actually playing the doctor was throwing a piece of wreckage, and the young Vraxith was chasing it and bringing it back, and the doctor was laughing, and the Vraxith was making sounds that could only be described as happy. Lieutenant Webb lowered his weapon, and his mouth hung open, and he could not find words for what he was witnessing. The matriarch watched the Marines arrive, and she watched their weapons and their armor and their fear, and she did not move. She sat beside the camp like a guardian statue, and her eyes tracked every soldier, but her posture remained calm. She was not going to attack. She was waiting to see what the humans would do. Admiral Chung came down on the second wave of dropships, and she walked into the camp with her command staff, and she looked at the matriarch, and she looked at the doctor and the cub, and she asked someone to please explain what in the name of all the stars was happening. Dilara explained. She told the Admiral about the crash, and the 3 weeks of fear, and the morning when the matriarch appeared with her dying cub. She told her about Dr. Jonah Reyes and his impossible surgery and his refusal to let death win. She told her about the days that followed and the protection the matriarch provided and the bond that had formed between the doctor and the cub. She told her about the naming ceremony and what it meant. When she finished, Admiral Chun was silent for a long time. Then she asked to speak with Dr. Reyes. Jonah walked over to the Admiral with the cub padding along beside him, and he saw the way the Marines tensed, and he saw the way their fingers tightened on their weapons, but the cub ignored them, and it sat down next to Jonah, and it looked at the Admiral. With curious eyes, Admiral Chun studied the cub, and she studied Jonah, and she saw the way they stood together, and she understood that whatever had happened here was real. She asked Jonah if he understood what he had done. Jonah nodded, and he told her that he had saved a life. Admiral Chun shook her head, and she told him that he had done much more than that. She told him that a Vraxath matriarch had claimed a human as pack, and by their ancient laws that meant an attack on Jonah or anyone under his protection was an attack on her bloodline. She told him that the Vraxath did not forgive attacks on their bloodlines, and they did not forget, and they pursued vengeance across generations and across star systems and across centuries. She told him that he had just become the most protected human in the galaxy, and possibly the most important. Jonah looked at the matriarch, and he looked at the cub, and he thought about what the Admiral was saying. He had not thought about politics when he knelt beside a dying child, and he had not thought about galactic implications when he worked through the night to save a life. He had just done what doctors do. He had healed someone who needed healing, and now he was beginning to understand that his simple act of compassion had consequences that reached far beyond this single world. The Terran Union suddenly had an ally that made every other species very nervous. The Vraxath were feared throughout the galaxy, and that fear had kept them isolated and alone and locked in endless cycles of violence. But now a door had opened, a bridge had been built, and it had been built by a man with steady hands and a stubborn heart, who refused to see monsters when he looked at people in pain. The evacuation took 3 days, and the colonists boarded the transport ships, and they left Kala 7 behind. But Jonah did not travel alone. Cub followed him onto the shuttle, and it curled around his feet during the journey to the flagship, and it growled softly at anyone who approached with anything less than respect. Admiral Chun watched this, and she shook her head in amazement. She told Jonah that he could not keep a war beast as a pet. The matriarch was watching from the shuttle bay, and she made a sound that might have been laughter. Jonah looked at the Admiral, and he smiled. He told her that the cub was not his pet, he was its human. Matriarch would not come with them to human space, but she would return to her world, and she would speak to the other matriarchs, and she would tell them what had happened. She would tell them about the human who saved her child. She would tell them about the bridge that had been built, and slowly over months and years, the story would spread. The Vraxath would learn that not all humans were enemies, and the humans would learn that not all Vraxath were monsters. It would not be easy, and there would be setbacks and misunderstandings, and moments when the old hatreds threatened to destroy what had been built. But the door was open now, and it would never fully close as the fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace. Jonah stood at a viewport and watched Kala 7 grow smaller in the distance. The cub pressed against his leg and made a sound of contentment. Jonah thought about everything that had happened, and everything that was still to come, and he felt the weight of it settling onto his shoulders. He had not asked for this responsibility, and he had not wanted to become a symbol or a bridge or a key to galactic peace. He had just wanted to save a life. But sometimes that was how the universe worked. Sometimes one act of kindness rippled outward and changed everything. Sometimes one person refusing to give up made the impossible possible. The galaxy was vast and dark and full of fear and hatred and species that had been killing each other since before humans learned to walk upright. But now there was a spark of something new now. There was hope, and it had all started because a war beast watched in silence as a human medic attempted the impossible, and the human had succeeded. The jump to hyperspace engaged, and the stars stretched into lines of light, and Jonah felt the cub's warmth against his leg. Whatever came next, they would face it together, human and Vraxath family. The galaxy would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be.